I had been praying for God, what do you have, Father, for us? Because we were talking about, in a covenantal relationship, in a covenantal series, we were talking about our relationship with God, right? And in the marriage relationship had to be talked out a big time, right? And our brothers, they shared their testimony about their marriage and how God healed their marriage from brokenness to now transformation, and then God is actually still healing their marriage. It's not perfect though. So, and then they now get to enjoy the relationship with God. And today, even as we delve into this topic of marriage, a biblical marriage, I'm going to touch this today, and then our brothers will bring they will speak from other other aspects. So I'm going to talk about marriage as God's design, marriage as God's design. So, or a provision. All right. So when you think about marriage, like, what comes to your mind? It's so many things happen. Like there's this definition, like in the word, it's just like almost like feels like challenging, right? Given a culture, from a culture to culture or a place to place, we define marriages in a different way. For some, it is very challenging, right? For some, it is very unaffordable. Like here, especially here in Hong Kong, it's just like, to think about marriage is like, for when I went on asking to young people especially, marriage, baby, is like, no, I don't have time for those kind of things. It's just like time and work takes a huge part of our lives, and then we don't have time for the marriage and that kind of thing. It seems and sounds very challenging and very daunting. But for some, marriage is really, it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful, a big thing, right? It's something that provides this life to grow. It's a blessing for generation to generation to flourish. And what we know from the Bible, what is the biblical perspective of marriage is that it's really you can see on the screen, that it is the sacred union that God has designed, right? It is not in human invention, but it is sacred union that God has designed for men and women to come together for a lifelong covenant relationship, all right? To journey on a relationship, to walk together in loving faithfulness, in loving each other, and in a beautiful companionship, friendship, mutual sharing, mutual supporting mutually to each other. So God actually, in a biblical perspective, what we see is that this marriage is actually designed by God for us to enjoy each other in a relationship, but also to enjoy God, His blessings, all right, in our lives, and to ultimately reflect what it really looks like, a family of God on earth, and to glorify God from our marriage, from our relationship, right? And that's what we see in the Bible, that God does that again and again. We see all kinds of marriages, like a bad marriage, a good marriage, and all kinds of marriages. But we see that God is always there in that marriage, redeeming those marriages, giving hope, bringing hope into those marriages. So God becomes this triangle God, this part like the husbands and wife, and then this God actually brings things together. Right? When you read in Ephesians, in Genesis 2:18, what you see is that it is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him. Now, this passage actually speaks about God actually cares for the deep emotional needs of human beings, right? He knows he knows that we need a friend, we need a companionship that actually otherwise an animal cannot fulfill. Like when you read Genesis, Adam was given like a choice to actually find a suitable helper amongst the animals, but then he could not, and he says that he did not find a suitable helper, comparable friend amongst the beasts. So then he's kind of like alone and isolated, and God actually now brings Eve out of his own rib. Like there's this beautiful imagery, this beautiful story. And Eve, actually, the word Eve stands like, we gave our new daughter's name, Ager, Eve, right? Actually, it's Ager in Hebrew. The Ager, it means like a helper, a rescuer who actually runs toward helping a man, toward helping a person, like leaving her affairs, whatever affairs he was in, that she actually runs to help that person in order to rescue that person. So that's what it means to, what it means Eve, what stands Eve for. Actually, it's a suitable helper. It's not just a person like who is helping at the kitchen, cooking food and all of that. Maybe that is one aspect of the picture. But then a suitable helper that God brought to Adam was just that the rescuer. And actually that character belongs to God. All right? So God actually, you see, in a marriage, why he designed this marriage is because he cares for people. He cares for your emotional, your deepest needs that no one can actually fathom, no one can actually provide and then meet. You can see that. And in Ephesians 5:25, you can see, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. How many of you know these words? Yeah? Am I speaking strange language like that? I'm not married, like I don't need this message, kind of thing, So, all right. So this marriage actually really helps us understand our chemistry in our relationship. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave up himself for her. I really believe that marriage is a beautiful garden where actually husbands get to, there's this word, emulate or reflect or to demonstrate Christ-like love, the way Christ loved the church, a sacrificial love, self-giving love to his wife. All right, and in the same way, wives are encouraged to submit, to respect her husbands, right? And what I see in that is that many times the preachers or the people, they have taken that as subduing someone, or one person overpowering the other person. It's not like that. If you look at it in the words like when Paul says in Ephesians 5:22, like submit wives to your husbands, actually in 21, Paul starts saying like submit to one another as to the Lord. All right, submit one to one another as to the Lord. So Paul calls both wife and husbands to the mutual submission. And I believe that is the key for a healthy marriage, healthy relationship, any relationship, right? The mutual submission. And that's where actually lies the secret of our happy marriage, of a blessed marriage. That the Bible actually tells us, Bible actually teaches us to love and then to submit and to sacrifice oneself to each other, to admonish, to help each other, to grow in the Lord, and then to grow each other. I mean, like this last thing that I was just thinking about is just that on this, what is a biblical perspective on the marriage is that what pastors like us, we really fear of. What we fear of is not really the financial breakdowns or even the persecutions, right? Physical persecutions. I think the most dreadful thing for us as pastors is to see division, people divided, right? Churches being divided, or people just, like brothers and sisters fighting with each other. So amongst the leaders that divided. So, and that goes same with the leaders as well, the leaders in the world, that they don't want to see civil war happening. And like now we see in Manipur, there's this big clash happening amongst the tribes and all of that. So it's creating chaos. Now this division prevents life happen. Like the flourishing of life. It prevents, it kills, and it destroys everything. Everything it destroys. It destroys relationships. It's kind of like a cancer that actually destroys everything. Now, marriage is that God. Why, when I say God has designed this marriage is not just a religious institution or a custom that we are, or Christians, are to our people. They fancy about wearing gowns and all of that. It's not only just about this principle that we aim to have, but it is actually the very antidote. It's very medicine towards combating that disunity that divides people, right? It's a medicine towards bringing people to come together in unity, in harmony, and to live in a peaceful world, and to really to flourish. And that's why God created us, to be to multiply and to be fruitful. And marriage is the key. Marriage is the source of that God actually joins these men and women together, the human beings together, under His shade, under His grace, under His blessings, to flourish and not to be divided. And then really, that marriage, in that union, what happens is that it goes beyond the meeting the intimate or the intimacy or the physical needs. It really brings both the wife and husband, both a male and a female, these individuals together to be united emotionally, spiritually, and mentally. Right? I'm going to say it again. Like marriage unites both men and women to be together emotionally, spiritually, and mentally. And men, like when it says like, the both of them become one flesh. What happens when we see a man and women come together and become one flesh and work together, right? It becomes a bomb. It becomes like a powerhouse, right? There's nothing that a man and a woman cannot accomplish if they work together in unity. And that's what we have experienced in our lives as well. I'm going to share that later in my testimony as I just go on there. I don't know how many of you were aware of the kind of like, you look at the statistics in Hong Kong, like as I was just looking into this, and I'm not like a big researcher, but then in my limited research, I found that although there were like thousands of people getting divorced, right? You can see in 1991, 16,000 they were getting divorced. It jumped to 21,000 in 1920 to 19 before coming down to 16,000 in 2021. There is a decline there. You can see that. But then what has happened, now the trend is that people are getting more afraid in getting married because they have a lot of fears. The factors contributing to that, especially here in Hong Kong, the housing problems and then the long work hours, the pressures and all of that, it is making people less friendly toward thinking about just joining their knots together. Now also what is happening is that there was this guy, Dr. Fong, who says that why people are not actually being able to be happy in their marriage, or why they are not being able to come together, is because there are many factors. Like he says that Hong Kong couples often communicate on a functional level, but fail to address the emotional needs of each other. Conflicts often arise from communication problems, with some couples preferring not to talk about their problems at all. Right? And I think it's true. Like, it's true. Just like, autopilot, just marriage runs like autopilot, like the functional level, people just talking about what needs to be done and what not needs to be done, right? With good intentions. But then actually there is no intimate sharing. There is no space that where people can actually, the couples can come, or the individuals can come and share their hearts, what's happening in their lives. And when all of these things just bubbles up, comes out, and there is this big burst in their family. We have seen that again and again in our ministry as well, people suffering and going through these things. Now they offer solutions, and when you go out in the world, you will hear like, you have to have, first of all, honesty. You have to draw boundaries, right? You have to go and do this and that and all of. You will have all of these lists in TikToks, like how you, for a healthy marriage, what you should do, right? You have all these things. But then oftentimes I question myself, like why people, they fail. Even we have all these answers for a healthy relationship. Why we fail, right? Now it was 2000, just before that. So why people fail? And they kind of like develop this fear, like we have this fear that maybe this is impossible for us to do it. And then of course, especially couples, those who've been going through this journey, how difficult it is, right? To really like walk with someone different than you, right? There is not just like the struggle of communication, but there is so many things just factors into it, right? There's so many things that you have to navigate. It's not just you, one person, but then it's two of the people coming together. Now, today the message I wanted to actually share about, not the fear, or not to criticize on what has happened and what has not happened, and maybe like just give you some points, but then just really to raise this hope for us toward marriage, to bring or to move from fear to faith, all right? To see that yes, Marriage is difficult. Yes, there are difficulties in our relationship. We encounter, we face all of these problems, and we go through these storms in our lives. But then there is hope when we are in relationship with God for our marriage as well, so that we can hope for tomorrow. We can hope for something that is greater than our own needs. That's where I want us to think about. Moving from fear to faith. Moving from fear to faith. Can you say with me, moving from fear to faith? Fear to faith. Fear to faith. Fear to faith. Okay. It was 2008. All right. It was 2008 when I came as a young man to Hong Kong to be a missionary. I was fresh graduated, and then I just had in my mind that after God had redeemed my life, I had this experience of like transformation and all of that. So I really wanted to come and meet people and share the gospel with them. I just had that agenda in my life. So, but then with all the passion and with all the great things in my mind, I was broke. Financially, I was not that good, right? So, but it was okay. I mean, like when you ask, with most missionaries, like they're okay with that, because then what happens is that the call that I had received was something that was beautiful in my heart, and then I wanted to actually live that out. So when I came in Hong Kong, I started living with a drug addict for years, but that didn't bother me at all, because then I was actually reaching out to him as well. But during the course, what happened was just that I was praying to God, although I had set my priorities. I mean, it's very funny that I was just praying to God, God, I'm not here to run after the beautiful ladies. I'm here to really do your work, because I've had enough of that in India. So I want to do your work now. I just want to dedicate this time to you, God. I was just like praying like that. It was very funny. But deep inside in my head, I didn't know, maybe I was deciding. I don't know that. So God knows that. But then it's just what happened was that as I prayed that prayer, God did hear my prayers, and He started bringing a lot of the young people into our fellowship, and that became an excuse or that, and it was during those times that we took the young people to YWAM base, Youth of the Mission, where for the first time I saw now Trifina, my wife, present wife, right? So only one wife, okay? Only one wife, okay. So I saw Trifina there. She was leading worship, and nothing happened as such like like love at first sight. Nothing happened as such, because I was so focused in like wanting to do something. So, but I believe that it was God's grace that we met with each other, and she happens to be from the same place, same tribal group, and we begin to share a lot. So, formative years of our like building relationship, what I recall when I remember was that Trifina was very, I was attracted to that as well. Like Trifina was very attentive. She was a good listener. She would listen to me, for a long, long time. And then I had to learn that after our marriage to listen to her as well, because I was the only one speaking and sharing. So, and I asked her, like, why did you not share anything? And she said, like, you didn't ask me any questions at all, so I had to listen to you. So she was very patient and listening toward me, and I learned from her how to listen to her, deeply listening to her, right? So that happened. And then after that, what happened, we were growing not just from more than a casual friend, like we were kind of like then becoming romantic to each other, and we recognized and saw the need for us to discuss it together. Okay, I'm just going to pause there. We saw the need, as opposed to just to flow with the flow, we just saw the need for us to come and recognize and discuss it and place it in front of in front of each other, and really bring that to God. Now, for us, it was difficult because then Trifina was at the time leaving for India for a different ministry. She was working. She was pioneering a slum ministry in Kolkata, and I had just started my ministry over here in Hong Kong. So, location-wise, it would be a big problem for us to come together. So we thought, like, it's not going to happen. It's not going to work. So we had our doubts big time, and then I personally feel like this is not going to happen. So what happened after that was that then, even in the midst of hopelessness, in the midst of like impossibilities, God had a plan for our relationship. God had a plan for our marriage. Before Trifina returned from India, from one of our mission trips, I saw this dream that in my dream, I wanted to go into this city. Like I was rooting for this city, but then Spirit lifted me up, and then it took me into this place, like an island where I saw there were a lot of children, like Indian children. And in my spirit, now it was very strange. In my spirit, I was feeling that it is her, it is her, it is her, it is her. You do not know her quite well, but then you will get to know her. And I was also hearing the voice like, I'm giving her to you as a gift. Now that was enough for me to be affirmed and to be confirmed, right? And as we were struggling and then to make decisions, when I see these dreams, then I feel like, wow, God, really, truly, you're bringing us together. What happened after that was that Trippy and I came back from India, and we met and we shared our hearts. With all the uncertainties, what we're gonna do, we had very limited idea. Well, how are we gonna do how are we gonna live out the rest? But what happened was just that we were actually surrendering our lives to God. We were actually laying our hearts to God, knowing that God, we will step in faith because you are bringing us together. After 1 year, we married, and the marriage actually brought us together here in Hong Kong, and we started working and serving as a missionary at ICM. And that's where it began to vision to plan the church together. We began to pray for this cause. Now, that's a very sweet kind of like a story, kind of very good, with good ending. But as you all know, marriage life is not easy. If it would have been easy, then we would all have done it well, right? Marriage life is challenging. It's very challenging. We encounter a lot of problems in our own lives, both physical, both real problems, like material problems. We did not know where to live after marriage, after we got married. But we had to face those challenges. But then God provided yet. And we want to thank God for that as well. Now, the other challenge was that we had to navigate through our emotional challenges. We brought our own ways of doing things. Now we had to come together and then live as one person, and then to serve God and to serve people. So there were a lot of challenges in our lives. And for these challenges, what I called is the weeds of the marriage, the weeds in the marriage. How many of you know the weeds? What are they? What they do, right? I grew up cultivating as a farmer, right? When you sow the rice, you would not know there are weeds. There is weeds in that. So, but as you allow the plant to grow, after a while, when they become like this height, then you see the weeds come up as well. Now, at that time, you have to put your hands on it, and then you have to take out the weeds out of the rice, or else the weeds will sack the life out of the rice, and it will make it unproductive. It will make it unproductive. So you really have to take the weeds out of the rice, out of those plants, for other plants to bear the fruit. Now, that's what happened in our early formative years of marriage. What I recall the most is that we went on confessing our sins. We went on talking about the problems that we had. We went on talking about like, hey, I think this is how I do things, but then I see that it's not working. So actually, I remember like just went on like, even as being Christian, just fighting for for many things, even with the small cause, for the small things. I mean, like, of course, husbands cannot be cannot be overnight like that. He cannot pick up his socks or do laundries, right? So I do, it's like husband can is like, I feel like I'm in the category like I cannot categorize everything and put everything back. I just put everything back, pants and socks and everything in one drawer, right? Trifina actually does all the the socks here, the pants here, and then the half pants over there, and the shirts hangs over there. It does not go in one corner. Like so I had to just kind of like, we are geared differently. So what we had to solve, we had to come together and share. So I remember like as we were as we begin to come together, we had to wrestle through many things in our relationship, and encountering and seeing those weeds kind of like the surface, begin to come up. And as they surfaced, as they began to come up, one of the things that I did was is that we did was by God's grace was that we not we not only just like saw those things come up, but then or ignored it or try to pretend that okay it will solve later, but then we had to actually recognize it. Can you say recognize, and then uproot them, just like the weeds. We had to uproot them, recognize it, and then uproot them. Now, therefore, in marriage, it is very key for us to recognize the weeds that destroys your marriage, your relationship, and then to recognize them, and not just to recognize it, but then uproot them with the help of God in your life. Now, when I say weeds, what comes to your mind? What comes to your mind? The sin is the most vicious weeds in your marriage, right? The sin. And when I say sin, it's so generic. What kind of sin, right? Now, when we actually begin to live our married life, we saw a lot of the past hurts, trauma, even past sins, surfacing, come up time to time. The attitude, the characters come up, and competing to take rule in your life. We had to recognize those, and then bring before God and allow God to heal us, and then to really actually to share, communicate those things to each other, so that we can be healed from those past hurts. For an example, like when you read Adam and Eve in Genesis, what do you see? Adam and Eve, when they sin against God, what happens? They begin to quickly blame each other, right? They shift the blame each other to one another. Now many times as couples, especially early stage of marriage or early stage of relationship, like we are most vulnerable and vulnerable to Satan's enemy's attack, right? So what happens is that instead of going to God with our weaknesses, instead of bringing to God our shortcomings, instead of bringing to God our struggles, what happens oftentimes we hide, right? That's what we see in Adam and Eve's case as well. We hide from God. We hide our sins as well. And that becomes a hiding place for us, right? And that's not going to help, and that's not beneficial. That's not healthy in our relationship, we all know. But regardless, we hide, right? So that's what has happened in Genesis. But then one of the things that I saw, what will be powerful in our relationship is that God wants us to not to hide, but come to Him, especially in those times when we are facing difficulties in our lives, in our relationship. You can just take this as a relationship example as well. When we are struggling in our relationship, whatever that relationship that you are in, that instead of hiding with our problems, I think God calls us to face Him, to come to Him. Because it is beautiful to come to God, because He's a gracious God who gives us grace. And actually then when we come to God in His presence, we begin to experience His grace. And His grace allows us to see many things. Like in a very different in a very different lens, in a very different perspective. Like we can see things differently in our lives, and that's what we experience in our formative marriage life as well. Many couples, they want honesty in their relationship, right? They demand justice. I want you to be honest with me. I want you to be honest with me. And then the both of them, they fight, right? Everyone demands honesty. Everyone wants like a perfect couple, right? Who would just look for it like, okay, I'm just okay with half perfectness. No, everyone demands justice and honesty. Right? What happens when you keep putting that bar of honesty? When you fail, what happens? You cannot stand a chance. When you fail, you fear of losing things. Then what is the default mode for you to hide, to rescue yourself? Is to flee, is to hide, right? And we keep on hiding things from our spouse as well in order to flee from the circumstances. Because there's this honesty. Honesty is demanded. And one of the things that I want us to know as Christians, what is the difference between Christian marriage and then the marriage in the world is that That we as Christians know that we are all broken people. We all know that we are actually sinful people. We are imperfect people, incompatible people, right? And God, it is because of God's grace that we are saved, and because of God's mercy that we've been brought together as couples, right? We need to understand that our foundation was not in perfection. We need to know that we were wrecked and sinful people in everything, right? In every sense. But then it was because of God's grace that we have given a life, a choice to live a life that God actually, that reflects His beauty, His nature, His character. It is only because of God's grace that we are able to actually function as His people, as good people, right? So we should never forget that it was because of God's grace that we have been made alive, that we have been given grace to actually relate to each other. Now, many times we forget that, and then we try, actually we have seen that when the couples begin to then, what happens, like demand justice and honesty. And then when a couple, when the other person fails, then the problem begins to surface. We do not know how to handle that. And now, but instead of demanding justice and honesty, and of course that should be the number one thing that we are all actually gearing toward. We are gearing toward that perfection. But then here it is, one thing that I actually want us to see, that when you allow God's grace to flow into your lives, when you experience that grace, what I mean by that, when you experience that you are a sinful person, God has given you grace, God has forgiven your sins, and now you know that you, as a sinful person, if you are forgiven by God, then you have to show the same grace to your spouse, to your friend, in the same way. You have to forgive and love that person in the same way. Then actually you're making a room for grace to flourish. You're actually, I'm giving you a picture of like pasture, a pasture land in your relationship. A pasture land, like where actually you have time to think. You have time, a space to express your emotions, to express that you are a weak person. You are actually allowing, when you allow grace in your relationship, you allow a pasture land for both of you to come together and actually now just sitting yourself back and look and discern together and to share your hearts to each other. You allow grace to nourish your relationship rather than, okay, just like from one point to another point, you have to do this, you have to be this, all right? And then when you allow that grace to nurture your relationship, what happens? You grow, you nurture your relationship. You allow God's word to speak into your lives, and at the same time, you are able to hear someone else's pain and their hurt as well. Now that's what happened to us, to Tafin and I, that instead of just blaming, instead of shifting the blames, we had many times, I remember, like just sitting back and say, okay, all right, it's not going anywhere, so let's give ourselves grace. Let's make a point that we will, at the end of the day, we will come to a place where we will actually hear God's voice for ourselves and allow Him to speak into our hearts. And I believe, in those moments that those moments were the most fruitful times of our, in our marriage, that God began to stir in our hearts. God began to actually speak deeply in our hearts. He began to console us, comfort us. And He actually allowed us to see where I am actually failing, how I am not actually being gracious to the other person. And I really want us to point you to that direction as well. That do you have pasture lands, a space to run into where you actually can hear God's voice in your relationship? Right? Do you give grace to yourself? Now, in this hustling and bustling world, how are you doing with your relationship? Is there a place for you to really go into and hide under God's wing and then ask God, and discern your hearts before Him. This is very important. This is very key. And God actually, when you allow Him to speak to you, He will heal. He will heal you. He knows the deepest needs that you have ever encountered in your life, that you have felt or experienced in your life, that no one can actually meet. And God is actually, He knows that need, and He wants to actually first heal those things, and then He will actually then begin to bring healing in your relationship as well. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. You know, when we, it's really that when we begin to live as one person, when we think alike, when we begin to think as one person, then that's where actually things begin to unfold in your life, right? Many times what happens in the couple and in the marriage relationship is that you listen to a lot of the voices of your family, the needs of your family, and all of that. And there are so many things that compete to take your place in your relationship. Imagine a bucket, right? Imagine a bucket. Like there's a bucket, and a bucket is filled with a lot of the balls. And when you take that balls, like these balls are like the priorities in your life. When you have like small balls, if you fill your bucket with the small balls, like the priorities, right, of your children priorities, like educations or your ministry priorities or your work priorities, maybe a big ball work priorities. When you keep on filling that bucket with all the priorities of your life, what happens? If you do not have a ball, the big ball with a priority for your family, for your relationship, if you have not intentionally working out with your relationship, you're not taking your time to nurture and flourish your relationship, what happens? All the other ball actually takes over, especially the small balls. And then now at the end, if you want to put your priority, like the family priority, on the top, it won't stand there. It just falls away, right? So what happens is that there is a way that in a box, in a bucket, what would be the first ball, the priority ball that you want to actually put in there, right? Is it your work, or is it your relationship with God, or is it your relationship with your spouse, your wife, or your husband? Now, when you have placed and prioritized your box, your balls, then actually, if you have put into like the big balls, like your relationship with God, a big one, and your relationship with your spouse and your friend, your especially your children, now that becomes like there as a basis, and you build other things on top of that one. Now, we know that we have tried this and all of that, but then I think one of the things that what actually makes this thing work is really that word that I shared at the outset, at the beginning, the mutual support, the mutual sharing, the self-giving love. Really, the mutual support. When you begin to come as one body, and work together, these actually can happen in our marriage, in our marriage relationship as well. Right? Triffin and I can talk about our priorities. Now, it is very difficult with 3 kids right now to prioritize our times and to have times for each other, and the ministries and the church and all of that, and as being couple, right, young couple. Now, what happens? The time that we can invest with each other is the time that when all our children, they sleep, right in the middle of the night, right? But we do want to have time for ourselves and want to talk. But in that talk, it's not just like we share our emotions. We just share about things of what has happened in the day or ministries. But then we really want to actually share about what God actually wants us to do, what God wants us to have in our lives. Because that's the ultimate, do you remember that's the ultimate goal why God created the marriage in our lives. And that actually becomes a source of strength for our relationship. Yesterday as I was sharing with Rufina, that hey, I think sometimes it feels like we are in autopilot. We are just working, we're just going through this functional level of our marriage. Everything is just like rolling on and on and on and on, and meetings after meetings and all of that. So barely have time to really think about, hey, do you hear what God is speaking to us? And then we make a point that, hey, we are taking this short break. Why don't we just like set aside a time that we really want to hear God at this point of time, what you are speaking to us, where you want us to work in the areas of our lives, where you want us to actually to come away from the fear that we have in our marriage. The second, where you want us to actually then practice grace in our marriage. All right? How you want us to practice that grace. God, would you show us? We want to see that. And the third is just really that, God, how you want us to actually mutually lay down our rights. Rights that I think, I should be heard. Why she is not listening to me. Where he wants us and how he wants us to listen to each other, to lay down those rights. So we wanted to actually make that intentional so that we can actually hear from God. And then he's actually then leading us into these practices in our marriage as well. Now, it is very key for us. And I want us to work this salvation out in our marriage as well. The three things again, right? For you as well, what are those fears that you are facing in terms of marriage in your life as well? For those who are thinking of marriage, for those who have been going through the marriage journey, but those who would pray for the marriage of the people, or those who are in the relationship, of some kind of relationship, right? What are the areas that you are actually, you face fear, or you have the fear that, oh, this is impossible for us. Now, I want us to move from fear to faith. If God has designed this, then God is able to accomplish this. So you need to have faith in God, because that faith will both sustain and feed that relationship. I'm going to say it again. That faith will both feed and sustain that relationship. The second one, again, the practical is that in what areas you need to experience the grace of God for yourself. You need to be gracious to yourself. And after experiencing that grace, so that you can actually be gracious to the other person as well. Where have you been demanding justice and honesty, but you've been seeing failure after failure? Why? It's because you need to experience the God's grace in your life. So you need to experience God's grace. So in what areas you can or you want to experience God's grace? Would you allow Jesus to plant the seed of grace in your heart, in your lives? Would you want to be gracious to your wife, to your spouse? Would you? I was talking with Trifina, and sometimes we can't just come up with one conclusion, because see things, or we think like grace is sometimes grace means like excuse for sins. No, that does not mean like that. That's not what God is saying. It's not about cheap grace, but God gives us grace so that we can come to God and ask for forgiveness and be healed. If there is no grace, there is no space for us. We are doomed. We are judged. And because of God's grace, through Jesus Christ, He allows us to receive that grace and experience that grace. Now the third thing, again, I'm going to repeat, that how do you want to mutually submit? How do you want to mutually support your partner? How can you come as one person and think alike, feel alike, and work toward that goal, the mutual goal that God has given to you to glorify His name?